January 24th, 1945, began in silence. At exactly 7 a.m., First Lieutenant Garland Merle Connor stood inside a frozen command post on the eastern edge of France, watching German artillery tear apart the tree line ahead of him. Explosions ripped through snow-covered branches 400 yards in front of the American line, sending wood, earth, and ice into the air. Connor was 25 years old. He was small in stature, barely 5.5 feet tall, weighing just over 100 pounds. He had grown up on a tobacco farm in rural Kentucky, where the nearest school had been 15 miles away. He never finished high school. In March of 1941, long before America entered the war, he enlisted anyway. 4 years later, he was still fighting. By this winter morning, Connor had taken part in 10 major campaigns. He had landed in 4 amphibious assaults. He had been wounded 7 separate times. His most recent injury had sent him to a hospital only 3 weeks earlier. He had returned to his unit 2 days ago, bandages barely removed, because his battalion was running out of time and men. 3rd Battalion of the 7th Infantry Regiment had been holding the line for 18 straight days. Temperatures stayed well below zero. Snow covered the ground. There was no moonlight at night. Soldiers slept in frozen foxholes when they could sleep at all. German patrols tested their defenses every evening. In 2 weeks, the battalion had already lost 43 men, most to artillery and sniper fire. And the worst was not over. Connor was the battalion's intelligence officer. Officially, his job was to gather reports, interrogate prisoners, and mark enemy positions on maps. Intelligence officers were not supposed to fight at the front. They were meant to stay behind the line. Connor never did. Throughout the war, whenever the situation became desperate, he moved forward. His reputation was well known inside 3rd Battalion. 4 Silver Stars testified to that reputation, each awarded for moments when he had stepped into direct combat to save others. Now the situation was desperate again. The battalion was positioned north of the Colmar Pocket, the last major area of German-held territory in France. 850 square miles of frozen forests and farmland remained in enemy hands. The French First Army had already lost thousands of men trying to push the Germans back across the Rhine. The German High Command knew this was their last chance. Operation Nordwind, launched on New Year's Day, was the final major German offensive in the West. While the Battle of the Bulge raged farther north, German forces in the Colmar Pocket were preparing their own breakout attempt. And on this morning, they were about to strike. At 7:15 a.m., the artillery barrage intensified. Shells walked methodically across the American front line. Trees exploded. Frozen earth erupted like geysers. The bombardment lasted 12 minutes. Then, silence. Connor knew what that meant. The barrage was finished. The attack was coming next. The silence after the barrage was more frightening than the explosions. Connor raised his binoculars and scanned the shattered tree line. Smoke drifted low across the snow. The forest ahead looked empty, but he knew better. German artillery never fired without purpose. What followed was always worse. Moments later, movement appeared between the trees. Dark figures emerged slowly, deliberately. German infantry advanced in spread formation, rifles at the ready, using the smoke and terrain for cover. Behind them, something larger moved with heavy, unmistakable weight. Tanks. Connor adjusted his focus and felt his stomach tighten. The silhouettes were clear now. Panthers and at least 2 Tigers were rolling forward through the snow, their tracks chewing through frozen ground as if it were soft earth. 3rd Battalion had no tanks. Their own armor units were tied up miles away, supporting another sector. Anti-tank guns were limited. Bazooka teams were under strength. The line in front of Connor was about to face heavy German armor with infantry weapons, alone. The battalion commander shouted orders, but the reality was obvious to everyone watching. If the German tanks reached the American positions intact, the line would collapse. Foxholes would be crushed. Machine gun nests would be overrun. Retreat would turn into chaos under fire. Connor did not wait for permission. He closed his map, handed his binoculars to a nearby runner, and pulled his helmet tight. He grabbed a rifle and began moving forward toward the companies already under pressure. This was not his role. Intelligence officers were supposed to stay behind the line, collecting information, not becoming part of the fight. But Connor had never separated intelligence from action. He believed that knowing the battlefield meant standing on it. As he moved through the trees, German machine gun fire intensified. Bullets snapped through branches and buried themselves in the snow around him. Mortar rounds began to fall closer, forcing him to zigzag between shell craters. Ahead, American infantry was already pinned down. A platoon had been cut off by advancing German armor. Their radio was destroyed. Their position was exposed, and enemy tanks were closing the distance rapidly. If nothing changed, they would be wiped out within minutes. Connor reached the platoon just as a German shell slammed into the ground nearby, showering them with dirt and ice. He slid into a foxhole beside a stunned sergeant and immediately took stock of the situation. Men were shaken, but still fighting. Ammunition was low. 2 soldiers were wounded and unable to move. The platoon's bazooka team was gone. Connor understood the math instantly. They could not hold this position against tanks. They could not retreat fast enough under fire. Waiting for orders would cost lives they did not have. He stood up. Without hesitation, Connor began moving forward, alone, toward the advancing German armor. Several soldiers shouted for him to get down. Others thought he was insane. No officer, especially not an intelligence officer, walked directly toward enemy tanks on foot. Connor ignored them. He knew something they did not. The terrain ahead forced the tanks into a narrow approach. The forest and snow limited maneuverability. If he could draw fire, confuse the gunners, or delay the advance even briefly, it might give the battalion time to reposition or survive. He disappeared into the smoke. German machine guns shifted toward him immediately. Tracer rounds stitched the snow at his feet. A tank turret began to rotate in his direction. Connor kept walking. At that moment, the battle for the battalion stopped being about holding a line. It became about one man buying time. Connor moved straight into the open. Snow crunched under his boots as he advanced through drifting smoke. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to dive for cover, to disappear back into the trees. He ignored it all. The distance between him and the German armor closed rapidly, measured not in meters, but in seconds. The first machine gun burst caught him in the leg. He stumbled, but did not fall. Pain flared white and sharp, but his body kept moving. He raised his rifle and fired toward the lead tank, not with any expectation of damage, but with intent. The shots were a signal. Look here, not there. The tank responded immediately. Its turret snapped toward Connor, and the coaxial machine gun opened up. Snow erupted around him as bullets tore into the ground. Connor dropped to one knee, then forced himself upright again, continuing forward. Every step drew more fire away from the American infantry behind him. A second burst struck his arm. The impact spun him sideways, and he fell hard into the snow. For a moment, the world narrowed to breathing and pain. Blood soaked into his sleeve. His rifle lay half buried beside him. Behind him, American soldiers watched in disbelief. German gunners were now fully focused on Connor. The tanks slowed, adjusting their formation. Infantry hesitated, unsure whether this lone figure was bait, a distraction, or something worse. Connor rolled onto his side, grabbed his rifle with his uninjured hand, and fired again. This time, a shell exploded nearby, throwing him backward. Shrapnel tore into his chest and shoulder. His helmet flew off. Snow and smoke swallowed him completely. Most men would have stayed down. Connor did not. He dragged himself to his knees, then to his feet. Blood ran freely now, dark against the white snow. His movements were unsteady, but deliberate. He raised his rifle once more and continued firing short, controlled bursts. The German tank commander could not ignore him. The turret adjusted again, the gun barrel lowering. A high explosive round detonated just beyond Connor, blasting him off his feet. The shock wave slammed him into the ground with enough force to knock the air from his lungs. For several seconds he did not move. American soldiers began to shout. Some started forward instinctively, only to be pulled back by their sergeants. Going after him now would mean dying in the open. Connor lay still in the snow, his uniform torn, his body riddled with wounds. Then, slowly, he moved again. He pushed himself upright using one arm, swayed, and raised his rifle for the final time. The German tanks stopped advancing. They had been delayed far longer than planned. Smoke, confusion, and concentrated fire had disrupted their momentum. The infantry behind them hesitated, unsure how to proceed with their armor stalled. That hesitation was everything. Behind Connor, American units began to reposition. Machine guns shifted. Mortar teams adjusted their tubes. What had been a collapsing line moments earlier was stabilizing. Connor had done exactly what he intended. He had forced the enemy to fight him instead of breaking the battalion. Another burst of machine gun fire struck him center mass. This time, he did not rise. When the firing finally shifted forward again, Connor lay motionless in the snow, alone in the open ground he had chosen deliberately. But the German advance had lost its timing, and timing was the only thing the enemy could not afford to lose. For several long seconds, the battlefield froze. The German tanks had stopped. Their advance, meant to smash through the American line in minutes, had stalled in confusion. Smoke drifted across the snow. Infantry hesitated behind armor that no longer moved forward with confidence. Those seconds mattered. Behind Connor's fallen body, American soldiers reacted. Machine guns were dragged into new positions. Mortar crews dropped rounds with renewed urgency. Riflemen shifted fire lanes, focusing on German infantry now exposed without armored momentum to shield them. The battalion commander seized the moment. Orders cut through the chaos. Units pulled back from exposed ground and reformed along a tighter defensive arc. Anti-tank teams repositioned to angles that had been impossible moments earlier. What had looked like an inevitable collapse began to harden into resistance. German commanders sensed the change, too. The attack had lost its rhythm. Tanks that should have been advancing were now stationary targets, forced to adjust under concentrated fire. Infantry that expected cover found themselves crossing open snow without momentum. Mortar rounds began to land among their ranks, breaking formations before they could regroup. Connor had not destroyed a single tank, but he had shattered the attack's timing. German doctrine relied on coordinated movement, infantry and armor advancing together under precise artillery support. When that coordination broke, the attack lost its teeth. Hesitation replaced confidence. Delay replaced shock. The tanks began to withdraw slightly, backing into the cover of trees to reassess. German infantry followed, pulling wounded men and abandoning positions they had reached only minutes earlier. American artillery, now properly adjusted, found its targets. Shells exploded among retreating units. Snow and earth erupted in violent fountains. The German advance dissolved into scattered movement as units sought cover where there was none. Within half an hour, the attack was over. The line had held. American medics moved forward cautiously once the fire slackened. They reached Connor where he lay in the open snow, exactly where he had fallen. He was still alive, barely. His body was broken by multiple wounds. Blood loss was severe. He drifted in and out of consciousness as they worked, hands moving quickly despite the cold. Morphine dulled the pain, but nothing could undo the damage. As he was carried back toward the rear, soldiers along the line recognized him. Word spread fast. That quiet officer from intelligence, the one who never stayed behind, had stopped tanks with nothing but his body and his refusal to retreat. Men who had watched him walk into fire now understood why the line still existed. Connor was evacuated through snow-covered paths toward an aid station. Behind him, the battalion reorganized fully. Reinforcements arrived. The position that had nearly been lost hours earlier became a strong point the Germans would never break. By afternoon, the battlefield looked different. The snow was churned and scarred. Wreckage littered the forest edge. The immediate danger had passed, but the cost was visible everywhere. Connor would survive the day, but his war was over, and the consequences of what he had done were only beginning to be understood. Connor woke in a field hospital surrounded by white, canvas walls, bandages, and snowlight filtering through narrow openings. Pain arrived before clarity. It moved through his body in waves, sharp in places, dull, and crushing in others. He tried to move and failed. Doctors had worked through the night. He had been hit multiple times, machine gun rounds, shrapnel, blast injuries. His right arm was shattered, his leg badly damaged. The chest wound alone had nearly killed him. The medical staff spoke in measured tones, careful not to promise what they could not guarantee. Survival had been uncertain. Recovery would be long. Connor listened quietly. He did not ask about medals or reports. He did not ask what had happened after he fell. His first question was simple. Did the line hold? When the answer came, yes, he closed his eyes and said nothing more. The weeks that followed blurred together. Hospitals changed. Surgeons came and went. Pain became routine. Progress was slow, measured in small movements and reduced bandages. Connor's body healed unevenly. Some damage would never fully recover. His frontline service was finished. Word of what he had done spread through official channels faster than he expected. Reports were written, witness statements collected. Commanders described the attack that had stalled, the tanks that had hesitated, the line that had reformed. The narrative took shape not as a story of destruction, but of delay, the most valuable commodity on a collapsing front. Connor resisted attention. He had not acted for recognition. He had acted because there was no alternative. The moment demanded something immediate, and he had stepped into it without calculation beyond necessity. As his condition stabilized, orders arrived. He would not return to combat. The Army transferred him stateside for recovery. The war continued without him, moving eastward as winter loosened its grip. In quiet hospital rooms, far from the front, Connor had time to think. Time he had not allowed himself during years of fighting. The faces of men he had served with returned, uninvited. Moments replayed. The decision to move forward instead of back stood out, not as heroism, but as inevitability. He understood now what he had given up. He also understood what he had preserved. The battalion had survived. Men had lived. The position had held. That knowledge mattered more than any citation that might follow. Connor never claimed that what he did was extraordinary. He described it later as the only choice left when time ran out. The body had followed where responsibility led. Recovery continued, but the war remained present in every silence. He knew he would never return to the frozen forests where he had fallen. Others would finish the fight, and they would do so because the line had not broken. Recognition arrived slowly, almost reluctantly. While Connor recovered, reports moved upward through layers of command. Each retelling stripped the event of chaos and rebuilt it into clean sentences and timelines. Words like advance, delay, and counterattack replaced smoke, noise, and blood. What had been instinct became description. What had been necessity became valor. The recommendation for the nation's highest decoration followed. Connor was uncomfortable with the idea from the start. He did not argue against it, but he did not welcome it either. To him, the act had not been exceptional. It had been immediate. There had been no plan beyond stopping what was about to happen. He had not weighed consequences or outcomes. He had simply moved forward because nothing else remained. When officers spoke to him about the award, Connor listened politely and said little. He did not correct their language, but he did not adopt it. He understood that the Army needed symbols as much as strategies. Stories helped explain sacrifice to people far from the front. For Connor, the story felt incomplete. He knew how close everything had come to failure. He remembered the moments when the attack might have succeeded anyway. He remembered the men who had not survived long enough to be recognized. Medals did not account for randomness. The ceremony itself was brief and formal. Uniforms were crisp, words were measured, cameras recorded a version of events that fit neatly into a frame. Connor stood straight, lighter than he had been before the war, his movements limited by injuries that would never fully heal. When the medal was placed around his neck, he felt its weight more as responsibility than honor. Afterward, he spoke rarely about the action. When pressed, he redirected attention to the men who had held the line after he fell. He insisted that the delay mattered only because others used it. Alone, his act meant nothing. Together, it meant survival. This perspective confused some and impressed others. It did not change how the story was told. Connor returned home with a body permanently marked by the war. His military career ended quietly. There were no further promotions, no return to command. He carried scars that reminded him daily of the cost of stepping forward, when retreat would have been safer. Publicly, he became an example of courage. Privately, he remained a man who had done what was required and lived with the outcome. Valor, he believed, was not about fearlessness. It was about clarity when fear left no time for reflection. It was about acting without guarantee of success, because the alternative was unacceptable. The medal recognized a moment. The consequences lasted a lifetime. Returning home did not feel like an ending. For Connor, the war did not stop when the fighting did. It followed him into quiet rooms, into ordinary conversations, into moments where nothing demanded immediate action. The absence of urgency was unsettling. For years, every decision had carried weight measured in seconds. Now time moved slowly, almost carelessly. His injuries shaped his days. Pain arrived without warning. Movement required adjustment. Tasks that once felt automatic demanded patience. These were reminders that the body had paid a price the medal could not explain. People recognized him. Some thanked him. Others asked questions they did not know how to phrase. Connor answered briefly, politely, and changed the subject. He found it easier to talk about farming, weather, and work than about frozen forests and burning steel. The language of combat did not translate well to civilian life. Silence became a habit. Memory surfaced in fragments rather than stories. The sound of artillery in the distance, snow crunching under boots. The moment when moving forward felt inevitable. These images appeared without invitation and left without warning. Connor learned not to chase them and not to fight them. He accepted their presence as part of the cost. He avoided crowds when he could. Noise carried differently now. Sudden sounds tightened muscles before thought intervened. He noticed exits instinctively. These habits faded slowly, never completely. Work provided structure. Routine offered something familiar. Connor valued tasks with clear purpose and visible results. The war had taught him that effort mattered most when it produced stability for others. He carried that lesson quietly into everything he did afterward. He rarely spoke about the medal. When it appeared in conversation, he redirected attention to those who had not come home. He did not see himself as separate from them. Survival felt less like achievement and more like circumstance. Time passed. The war receded into history for many. For Connor, it became background, a constant presence that did not demand attention, but never left entirely. He did not seek to define himself by what happened in January of 1945. He simply acknowledged that it had shaped everything that followed. Life after war was not about forgetting. It was about learning how to live alongside what could not be changed. And for Connor, that meant carrying memory without letting it consume the present. With time, stories tend to simplify. Moments of chaos become clear decisions. Fear becomes courage. Survival becomes destiny. Yet the true legacy of Garland Merle Connor does not fit neatly into a single act or a single morning in the snow. It exists in everything that happened because that moment bought time. Connor did not stop an army. He did not destroy tanks. He did not turn the tide of the war by himself. What he did was smaller and far more important. He interrupted certainty. German commanders believed they had calculated the American position correctly. Artillery preparation, armor support, infantry movement, everything aligned. The attack was timed to break the line before it could respond. Connor's action shattered that timing. Not permanently, not decisively, just long enough. That pause allowed others to act. Machine guns repositioned, Mortars adjusted, infantry regrouped, the line reformed. War often turns on such margins. History remembers decisive victories, but wars are won through accumulation of seconds, meters, and choices made under pressure. Connor's decision belonged to that category. It did not win the battle alone, but it ensured the battle could still be fought. His legacy also challenges how courage is understood. Connor did not move forward because he believed he would survive. He moved because survival was no longer the priority. Responsibility was. The men behind him needed time. The line needed stability. The calculation was immediate and final. This is not recklessness. It is clarity. After the war, Connor never tried to elevate his story above others. He understood that countless similar acts went unrecorded. Men who stepped into danger without witnesses, without medals, without history, remembering their names. He carried his recognition with humility because he knew how arbitrary survival could be. The medal recognized a moment. The legacy lives in the outcome. Today, Connor's story endures not because it is dramatic, but because it is instructive. It reminds us that war is not shaped only by commanders or weapons, but by individuals who act when systems falter, when plans collapse, when manuals offer no answers. In those moments, history does not wait for permission. It waits for someone to move. Garland Merle Connor moved, and because he did, others lived to move as well. That is the measure of his legacy, not the distance he walked into fire, but the lives that continued forward because the line did not break. Some victories arrive with celebration. Others arrive quietly, measured only in the fact that tomorrow still exists.